The boarding announcement echoed through Denver International Airport as Derek grabbed his carry-on and headed toward the gate. I stood frozen, clutching my phone with trembling fingers, still processing what had just happened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Derek, wait!" I called out, but he didn't even turn around. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass with that routine smile flight attendants perfect, completely oblivious to the fact that my husband had just told me I could find my own way to Miami. The heavy glass doors closed behind him with a soft thud that somehow sounded like the end of everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The argument had started over something so trivial I could barely remember the details now. Derek's presentation materials, my suggestion about his PowerPoint slides, something about font sizes and professional appearances. But arguments with Derek were never really about the surface issue. They were about control, about making sure I knew my place in his carefully orchestrated world. Standing there in the bustling terminal, watching other couples navigate their travel day with normal, human consideration for each other, I felt the weight of 15 years settling on my shoulders like lead. My name is Victoria Hayes, though for the past decade and a half, I'd slowly let that identity shrink to accommodate Derek's expanding sense of importance. We'd met during my final year at Colorado State, when I was still Victoria Brennan, still dreaming about following in my father's footsteps in the aviation industry. Dad had built Summit Airways from nothing, transforming a small charter service into a regional powerhouse before his sudden heart attack 3 years into our marriage. Derek had been so supportive during those dark months, helping me navigate the grief while encouraging me to let the family trustees handle the complicated business details. "You need time to heal," he'd said. And I'd been grateful for his protection from the corporate complexities that felt overwhelming in my raw, emotional state. That was 12 years ago. 12 years of Derek building his consulting career while I built a comfortable suburban life around his needs and schedule. 12 years of dinner parties where I smiled and nodded while he held court about business strategies and market analysis. 12 years of gradually forgetting that I'd once understood aviation regulations and aircraft leasing agreements as naturally as breathing. Derek's colleagues knew me as the supportive wife who organized charity fundraisers and hosted impressive dinner parties. I'd become an accessory to his success story, polished and presentable but ultimately decorative. The morning had started normally enough. Our flight to Miami wasn't until noon, giving us plenty of time to navigate the usually chaotic Sunday departure schedule. Derek's quarterly business conference was being held at some luxury resort in South Beach, and I'd been looking forward to a few days of sunshine and possibly some time to myself while he networked with other consultants. I'd even packed my old aviation magazines, thinking I might catch up on industry developments during the poolside hours. But Derek had been tense from the moment we entered the airport. His presentation was scheduled for Tuesday morning and, despite having worked on it for weeks, he'd suddenly decided the whole thing needed restructuring. While we sat in the departure lounge, he'd spread his laptop and papers across 2 seats, muttering about competitive advantages and market positioning while other travelers shot us annoyed glances. I'd watched him fumbling with slide transitions and suggested he might want to simplify the visual elements to focus attention on his key points. "Victoria, I don't need design advice from someone whose biggest project this year was organizing the neighborhood book club," he'd snapped, his voice carrying further than necessary. Several nearby passengers looked up from their phones, and I felt heat rising in my cheeks. This presentation could determine whether Patterson Industries signs with our firm. The stakes are a little higher than choosing between Times New Roman and Calibri. The dismissive tone wasn't new, but something about hearing it in public, surrounded by strangers who were witnessing my humiliation, ignited something I'd kept buried for years. "I wasn't giving design advice," I'd replied, keeping my voice level but firm. "I was suggesting presentation strategy, something I actually know about from my business background, in case you've forgotten I had a career before we got married." Derek's expression had darkened at what he clearly interpreted as defiance. Your business background? Victoria? You? Took a few aviation management courses 15 years ago. Let's not pretend you understand corporate presentation dynamics. I understand more than you think, I'd said, and there was something in my tone that made him look up from his laptop screen. Maybe more than you've given me credit for. That's when the real fight began. Not the surface disagreement about PowerPoint aesthetics, but the deeper confrontation about respect and recognition that had been building between us for years. Derek's voice had gotten sharper and more condescending with each exchange, drawing stares from other passengers waiting for their own flights. He'd accused me of being resentful about his success, of trying to diminish his achievements because I'd never followed through on my own ambitions. I'd countered by pointing out that supporting his career had been a choice, not a failure, and that dismissing my intelligence and experience was both unfair and inaccurate. The argument escalated when Derek suggested I was having some kind of midlife crisis, questioning decisions I'd made years ago because I was bored with our comfortable life. You want to pretend you're some kind of business expert now? Fine. Prove it. Handle your own travel arrangements for once. Figure out how to get to Miami without me managing every detail for you. I'd stared at him in disbelief. Derek, we're traveling together. We have seats on the same flight. Not anymore. He'd stood up, gathering his materials with dramatic efficiency. I'm upgrading to first class. You can stay back here with the regular passengers and practice your independence. Even then, I'd thought he was bluffing. Some kind of theatrical gesture meant to make a point about partnership and mutual respect. I'd watched him walk to the gate counter and speak with the agent, gesturing toward the boarding area. The agent had nodded and typed something into her computer, and Derek had returned with a different boarding pass. Problem solved, he'd announced. I'll see you at the hotel, assuming you can figure out how to get there. The first boarding call had proven he wasn't bluffing. Business class passengers were invited to board, and Derek had joined the line, without a backward glance. I'd followed him to the gate, still expecting some kind of reconciliation or admission that he'd gone too far. Instead, he'd paused just before the boarding door and delivered his final blow. Maybe this will teach you something about the difference between theoretical knowledge and real-world problem-solving. Good luck figuring it out, Victoria. I'm sure your vast aviation expertise will come in handy. Then he was gone, disappearing. Down the jet bridge while I stood in the boarding area holding my economy ticket and trying to process what had just happened. The gate agent who'd helped Derek with his upgrade approached me with professional concern. Ma'am, are you planning to board? We're about to begin general boarding. I looked down at my ticket, then up at the departures board showing our flight to Miami. My flight to Miami, apparently. Derek had made it clear I was no longer part of his travel plans, and the thought of sitting in economy class for 3 hours, knowing he was drinking champagne in first class while other passengers whispered about the couple who'd had a public meltdown, felt unbearable. Actually, I need to make some changes to my reservation, I told the gate agent, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I won't be taking this flight after all. The relief I felt making that decision should have worried me, but instead, it felt like taking the first full breath I'd drawn in hours. Derek wanted me to prove I could handle travel arrangements independently? Fine. I'd prove exactly that. But I wouldn't be following him to Miami like some apologetic wife begging for forgiveness. If he wanted to attend his conference alone, he could explain my absence to his colleagues, however he chose. I made my way back to the main terminal, pulling out my phone to cancel my hotel reservation and start exploring other options. The weekend was young, and for the first time in years, my schedule belonged entirely to me. Derek had intended his abandonment as a lesson in humility and dependence. Instead, he'd accidentally handed me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: complete freedom to make my own choices. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having this confrontation in an airport. Aviation had been my first love, my intended career path, the industry where I'd planned to build my professional identity. Dad used to bring me to Denver International when I was young, explaining the intricacies of flight operations and airline management while we watched planes taxi on the runways. He'd died before I could join him in the family business, and Derek had been so supportive during those grief-stricken months when Summit Airways felt like too much responsibility to handle alone. Now, walking through the terminal that had once felt like a second home, I found myself remembering details I'd forgotten. The way morning light streamed through the massive windows in Concourse B, the distinctive mountain peaks visible from the observation areas, the complex choreography of departure boards and ground crews that Dad had taught me to read like sheet music. This place held memories of who I'd been before I'd learned to make myself smaller to fit into Derek's vision of our life together. I found a quiet corner near a coffee shop and opened my laptop, determined to prove Derek wrong about my capability to handle complex arrangements. But as I stared at travel websites and hotel booking pages, an unexpected thought surfaced. Why? Was I trying to salvage a vacation that was supposed to celebrate Derek's business success? Why was I planning some alternative trip to prove I could navigate logistics independently, when what I really wanted was to understand how I'd gotten to this point in my marriage? The coffee shop was busy with Sunday travelers, families heading home from weekend visits, and business people preparing for Monday meetings in distant cities. I ordered a latte and found a small table near the window, watching planes taxi toward runways while I tried to sort through the emotional wreckage of the morning. Derek's cruelty hadn't been entirely unpredictable. He'd been growing more dismissive and controlling over the past few years, though I'd told myself it was stress from his expanding business responsibilities. But something about his final words at the gate kept echoing in my mind. "I'm sure your vast aviation expertise will come in handy." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sarcasm had been intended to sting, to remind me that my business knowledge was outdated and irrelevant. Instead, it had triggered something I'd buried so deeply I'd almost forgotten it existed. I did have aviation expertise. I'd spent my childhood and college years immersed in airline operations, aircraft financing, and industry regulations. More importantly, I had legal claims to a family legacy I'd never properly explored. Summit Airways, the company Dad had built from a 2-plane charter service into a regional carrier with roots throughout the Mountain West. When he'd died, the grief and shock had made complex business decisions feel impossible to navigate. Derek had encouraged me to trust the family lawyers and established trustees, assuring me they'd protect my interest while I processed my loss. I'd signed documents I barely read, grateful for Derek's guidance and protection during those overwhelming months. 12 years later, I'd never questioned how Summit Airways was performing or what my actual ownership stake meant in practical terms. Derek occasionally mentioned receiving dividend checks, which he deposited into our joint account along with his consulting income. I'd assumed the trustees were handling everything competently, and Derek seemed satisfied with the financial arrangements. But sitting in the airport terminal where I'd once felt so at home, I realized I'd never investigated what I'd actually inherited from Dad. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek, sent from the plane that was probably taxiing toward takeoff. "Hotel reservation is under my name. You'll need to make your own arrangements if you decide to join me. Maybe this experience will help you appreciate what I handle for our family." The condescending tone was so familiar I almost laughed. Derek genuinely believed he was teaching me a valuable lesson about gratitude and dependence. He had no idea he'd just given me the push I needed to rediscover parts of myself I'd abandoned years ago. Instead of booking a flight to chase after him, I opened my laptop and began searching for something completely different. Marcus Chen had been Dad's lawyer and friend for over 20 years. If anyone could help me understand my current relationship with Summit Airways, it would be Marcus. I'd seen him occasionally at social events over the years, and he'd always asked how I was doing with genuine warmth. But we'd never discussed business matters. Derek typically handled any legal questions that arose, and I'd been content to let him manage those details. Now I scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus's number, then hesitated before dialing. It was Sunday afternoon, and I had no idea if he'd be available for what might be a complicated conversation. But something about Derek's abandonment had stripped away my usual caution about inconveniencing other people. I pressed call and waited. Victoria? Marcus's voice carried surprise and pleasure. What a wonderful surprise. How are you doing? I'm actually calling with some questions about Summit Airways, I said, deciding directness was better than small talk. I realize this might sound strange, but I'm not entirely sure what my current relationship with the company actually is. Derek has been handling most of our legal and financial matters, and I've never gotten a clear picture of how things stand. There was a pause that lasted long enough to make me wonder if I'd overstepped some boundary. Then Marcus spoke carefully. Victoria, have you been receiving the quarterly reports from the Board of Trustees? They should be mailed to your address. Every 3 months with detailed financial statements and operational updates. I don't think so, I said slowly. Derek handles our mail and banking. He's mentioned dividend payments, but I've never seen detailed reports. Another pause, longer this time. Victoria, I think we need to have a conversation in person. Are you available to meet sometime this week? There are some things about your inheritance and current position with Summit Airways that you should understand clearly. The seriousness in his tone sent a chill through me. Marcus, is there something wrong? Has the company been having problems? Quite the opposite, actually. Summit Airways has been performing exceptionally well. That's part of what we need to discuss. Victoria, are you somewhere private where we can talk freely? I looked around the busy coffee shop and realized this wasn't the right setting for whatever Marcus needed to tell me. I'm at the airport right now. Derek and I had a disagreement, and I'm trying to figure out my next steps. Could we possibly meet today? I know it's Sunday, but this feels important. It is important, Marcus confirmed. And yes, I can meet you today. My office is only about 20 minutes from DIA. If you're comfortable coming by, I can explain some things that might help clarify your situation. We arranged to meet at his office in an hour, giving me time to take the train downtown and gather my thoughts. As I packed up my laptop and headed toward the airport exit, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Derek had intended his abandonment to teach me about my limitations and dependence. Instead, he'd accidentally forced me to confront questions I should have been asking years ago. The train ride into downtown Denver gave me time to think about what Marcus might tell me. Dad had always been secretive about business details, not from any desire to exclude me, but from his old-fashioned belief that financial complexities were burdens children shouldn't carry. When he died so suddenly, I'd been focused on grief and wedding planning, grateful for Derek's willingness to handle the legal complications that followed. But now I wondered what I'd missed by letting Derek manage my inheritance. What had those quarterly reports contained? Why did Marcus sound so serious when discussing Summit Airways' performance? And why did I have the growing feeling that Derek's knowledge of my financial situation was more detailed than he'd ever let me realize? Marcus's office building was one of those sleek downtown towers that housed Denver's legal and financial elite. The Sunday quiet felt almost eerie as I rode the elevator to the 15th floor, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Marcus met me at his office door, and I was struck by how much older he looked than at the social events where I usually saw him. The silver hair and lined face spoke of wisdom and experience, but also of concerns that went deeper than casual conversation. Victoria, thank you for coming, he said, ushering me into his office. I've been hoping for years that we'd have this conversation. There are things about your father's legacy and your current position that you need to understand. We settled into the comfortable chairs around his conference table, and Marcus opened a thick file folder that had my name written across the tab. The documents inside looked official and important, full of legal language and financial figures that meant nothing to me without context. "Let me start with the basics," Marcus said. "When your father died, he left you controlling ownership of Summit Airways. Not partial ownership, not a minority stake. Controlling ownership. You currently own 58% of the company's stock, which means you have decision-making authority over all major business operations." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. But Derek always said the trustees were running everything. That I was just a beneficiary receiving dividends from Dad's investment. Marcus's expression grew troubled. "The trustees manage day-to-day operations, but they serve at your discretion. You have the authority to replace them, modify their mandates, or take direct control of business decisions whenever you choose. More importantly, you have the right to receive detailed financial reports and participate in all strategic planning discussions." "I've never received any reports," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I began to understand the implications. "The reports are mailed to your home address quarterly," Marcus replied. "If you haven't been seeing them, someone else has been intercepting your mail. Victoria, Summit Airways has been extraordinarily successful over the past decade. The company is currently valued at approximately $47 million, which means your controlling stake is worth over $27 million. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. $27 million. I owned a controlling stake in a $27 million company, and I'd been living like a dependent housewife, grateful for whatever financial scraps Derek chose to share with me. The quarterly reports that should have been keeping me informed about my own business had been disappearing before I ever saw them. Derek's careful management of our finances suddenly took on a much darker meaning. "There's more," Marcus continued gently. "The Board of Trustees has been requesting guidance from you for years on expansion opportunities and strategic partnerships. They've been making conservative decisions because they haven't received direction from the controlling shareholder, you, about your vision for the company's future." I felt like I was drowning in information that recontextualized everything I thought I knew about my life. "Marcus, what exactly has Derek been telling you when these matters come up? He must have been communicating with your office on my behalf." "That's just it, Victoria. Derek has never communicated with our office about Summit Airways business. We've sent correspondence to your home address and copied Derek on some documents as your spouse, but he's never responded to any inquiries or participated in any business discussions. From our perspective, you've simply chosen to remain uninvolved with the company operations." The betrayal was so complete and systematic that I could barely absorb its scope. Derek hadn't just been intercepting my mail and hiding my financial situation from me. He'd been allowing the trustees to believe I was deliberately choosing not to participate in my own company's management. For 12 years, I'd been the absent owner of a multi-million-dollar business, while Derek built his consulting career on the foundation of what he must have known was my substantial financial independence. "I need to see everything," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Every report, every correspondence, every decision that's been made on my behalf. I need to understand what I actually own and what my options are." Marcus nodded and began pulling documents from his file. "Victoria, there's something else you should know. Summit Airways has been approached by 3 major airlines over the past 2 years about potential acquisition offers. The trustees have been waiting for direction from you before responding to any of these inquiries. If you were interested in selling, you could walk away with substantially more than your current equity value." As he spread financial reports and correspondence across the conference table, I found myself thinking about Derek's reaction when I'd suggested I understood more about business than he'd given me credit for. His immediate dismissal and condescension made perfect sense now. He couldn't afford for me to start questioning my own capabilities or investigating my financial situation too closely. His control over our marriage depended on my belief that I was financially dependent on his success. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. Not just hiding mail or managing bank accounts, but actively preventing me from accessing information about my own inheritance, allowing me to believe I was a financially dependent spouse while knowing I was actually the majority owner of a successful company, building his career and social status while ensuring I remained ignorant of my own economic power. Marcus, I said slowly, if I wanted to take an active role in Summit Airways management, what would that process look like? His smile was the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen all day. Victoria, it would be as simple as calling a board meeting and announcing your intentions. You're the controlling shareholder. The company is yours to run, however you see fit. For the first time since Derek had abandoned me at the airport gate, I smiled too. He'd wanted to teach me a lesson about independence and capability. He was about to learn that I was far more independent and capable than he'd ever imagined. The question now was how to use this information and what kind of future I wanted to build with the resources I'd never known I possessed. Derek thought he'd left a helpless, financially dependent wife stranded at the airport. Instead, he'd accidentally triggered the awakening of a woman who owned an airline. The weight of Marcus's revelations settled over me like a heavy blanket. As I sat in his office Sunday evening, staring at financial documents that revealed the true scope of my inheritance. $27 million in airline equity, quarterly reports I'd never seen, board meetings where my absence had been noted and questioned. The systematic deception Derek had orchestrated was so complete that I felt like I was learning about a stranger's life rather than my own. Marcus had given me copies of everything. Thick manila folders containing years of correspondence, financial statements, and strategic planning documents that painted a picture of Summit Airways as a thriving regional carrier with expansion opportunities I'd never known existed. The trustees had been conservative but competent, growing the company's value steadily while waiting for guidance from an owner who didn't even know she had the authority to provide it. Victoria, I have to ask, Marcus said as we finished reviewing the most recent quarterly reports. Has Derek ever mentioned specific figures when discussing your inheritance? Has he given you any indication of the actual value involved? I thought, back through years of conversations about money and investments, trying to remember Derek's exact words when the subject of Summit Airways came up. He's always been vague about the details, I admitted. When dividend checks arrive, he mentions them as income from your father's business, but never specific amounts. I assumed they were modest payments from a small regional company. Marcus pulled out a calculator and showed me the math. Victoria, your dividend payments over the past 3 years alone have totaled nearly $800,000. Combined with Derek's consulting income, your household has been operating on well over $500,000 annually. Those aren't modest payments from a struggling business. The numbers made my head spin. $500,000 annually. I'd been living on that income while believing myself financially dependent on Derek's career success. Every time I'd hesitated to spend money on something I wanted, every time I'd deferred to Derek's financial decisions because I thought he was the primary breadwinner, I'd been operating under a completely false understanding of our economic reality. The dividend payments go directly into your joint checking account, Marcus continued. Derek would have seen every deposit, would have known exactly how much income was coming from Summit Airways. There's no way he could have been unaware of your financial independence. I felt sick thinking about the implications. Derek hadn't just been hiding information from me. He'd been actively allowing me to believe lies about my own economic situation. Every discussion we'd had about major purchases, every decision about household budgets, every time he'd made me feel guilty about not contributing financially to our marriage, he'd known I was actually the primary income source. Marcus, I need to understand something, I said slowly. If I wanted to make changes to how Summit Airways operates, if I wanted to be more involved in strategic decisions, what would that process look like practically? His expression brightened considerably. Victoria, as the controlling shareholder, you have complete authority over the company's direction. You could call a board meeting tomorrow and announce new initiatives, replace trustees, modify operational strategies, or even explore those acquisition offers we mentioned. The current board has been waiting 12 years for you to express interest in active management. And the acquisition offers? You mentioned 3 major airlines had made inquiries? Marcus rifled through his files and pulled out several thick proposal documents. United, Southwest, and Alaska Airlines have all submitted preliminary offers over the past 18 months. The trustees forwarded these to you through regular mail, but since you never responded, they assumed you weren't interested in selling. I stared at the proposal covers, recognizing the corporate logos of major carriers I'd grown up hearing Dad discuss as both competitors and potential partners. What kind of numbers are we talking about? The most recent offer from Alaska Airlines values Summit Airways at $52 million, which would give you approximately $30 million after taxes and transaction costs. But Victoria, that's assuming you want to sell. With the right strategic investments, Summit Airways could be worth significantly more in 5 years. $30 million. The figure was so large it felt abstract, like discussing the distance between planets rather than money that could actually exist in bank accounts. I'd spent 15 years of marriage believing myself financially dependent while sitting on assets that could fund any lifestyle I chose. The betrayal was so comprehensive that I could barely process its emotional weight. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said gently. "The trustees have been requesting permission to upgrade Summit Airways' fleet and expand into new markets. They've identified opportunities for lucrative routes to the Pacific Northwest and increased frequency on existing Mountain West connections. With your approval, they could increase the company's profitability significantly over the next few years." I thought about Derek's dismissive comments at the airport about my outdated aviation knowledge. He'd mocked my understanding of the industry while knowing I owned a successful airline company. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. He'd spent years discouraging my interest in aviation and business, while secretly benefiting from the income my inheritance provided. My phone buzzed with another text message from Derek, this time sent from what must have been his Miami hotel. "Arrived safely. Hotel wouldn't accommodate a room change since reservation is in my name. You'll need to book separately if you decide to join me. Hope this experience is educational." The condescending tone that had once made me feel small and apologetic now seemed pathetic, rather than intimidating. Derek was texting from a luxury hotel paid for with income that came primarily from my company, offering to let me join him if I could arrange my own accommodations. He had no idea that I could buy the entire hotel if I wanted to, or that I owned an airline that could fly me anywhere in the world. "Marcus, I want to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning," I said, surprised by the decisiveness in my own voice. "I want to meet the trustees, review current operations, and start making strategic decisions about Summit Airways' future." His smile was radiant. "Victoria, I've been hoping for this conversation for 12 years. The trustees are going to be thrilled. They've been operating conservatively because they didn't want to make major moves without input from the owner, but they've had ambitious plans waiting for your approval." We spent the next hour scheduling the meeting and discussing logistics. Marcus would contact the 3 trustees who managed Summit Airways' day-to-day operations and arrange for tomorrow morning's gathering at the company's headquarters near the airport. I would finally see the business Dad had built, meet the people who'd been growing my inheritance for over a decade, and start making decisions about my own financial future. As I prepared to leave Marcus's office, he handed me one final folder. "These are the original documents from your father's will and the trust establishment. I think you'll find them interesting reading. Your father had very specific intentions about your role in the company's future." I drove back toward the airport as the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, my mind reeling with information that recontextualized everything I thought I knew about my life. The rental car Derek and I had driven to the airport that morning was still in the parking garage, another reminder of how completely the day had diverged from our original plans. He'd expected me to take a taxi home in shame after being abandoned, maybe spend the evening reflecting on my dependence and limitations. Instead, I was driving home with documents proving I owned a multi-million-dollar company and had been living under false assumptions about my own economic power for over a decade. Derek's cruel lesson about independence was about to backfire in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The house felt different when I walked through the front door that evening. The carefully decorated rooms that had always felt like evidence of Derek's success now looked like stages where I'd been performing the role of grateful dependent wife. The furniture we'd chosen together, the artwork that reflected his tastes more than mine, the kitchen where I'd prepared countless dinner parties for his colleagues, all of it felt like props in a play where I'd been acting a part that wasn't real. I spread Marcus's documents across our dining room table and began reading through years of Summit Airways reports. The company Dad had built was even more impressive than I'd realized. Starting with 2 charter planes and a handful of seasonal routes, he'd grown Summit Airways into a regional carrier with 43 aircraft, 1,200 employees, and service to 37 cities across the Mountain West and Southwest. The financial reports showed steady growth even through economic downturns that had damaged larger airlines. The trustees had been prudent but ambitious, investing in fuel-efficient aircraft, upgrading airport facilities, and maintaining customer satisfaction ratings that exceeded industry standards. Reading through their strategic analyses, I could see they'd been positioning Summit Airways for either continued independent growth or an advantageous acquisition by a major carrier. My father's original will made his intentions clear. He'd established the trust structure to protect the company during my young adulthood, but he'd always expected me to take active control once I was ready for the responsibility. The trustees were temporary stewards, not permanent managers. Dad had envisioned me eventually running Summit Airways, as he had, making strategic decisions and guiding the company's future development. Your daughter has inherited your passion for aviation along with your business acumen, the will read in a section addressed to the trustees. When she's ready to assume leadership responsibilities, I trust you'll support her transition into active management. Summit Airways was built as a family legacy, and Victoria represents that legacy's future. Reading Dad's words 15 years after his death, I felt a complicated mixture of grief and anger. Grief for the conversations we'd never had about the company's future. Anger at myself for letting Derek convince me to abandon the path Dad had envisioned for me. But underneath those emotions was something else. Excitement about possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. I spent the evening researching current aviation industry trends, reading about regional airline performance and consolidation patterns. The knowledge came back more easily than I'd expected, like a language I'd learned fluently before setting aside for years. Derek had been wrong about my business understanding being outdated. The fundamentals of airline operations hadn't changed dramatically, and my economics background gave me tools for analyzing the strategic decisions Summit Airways would need to make going forward. By midnight, I'd developed a preliminary understanding of the company's current position and future options. The trustees had been competent stewards, but they'd been operating without strategic vision from ownership. Summit Airways could continue as an independent regional carrier, expand into new markets with additional aircraft purchases, or accept one of the acquisition offers from major airlines. Each option had advantages and risks that deserved careful analysis. More importantly, I'd begun to understand what Derek's deception had cost me beyond just financial awareness. He'd stolen 12 years of potential involvement with Dad's company, 12 years of developing business expertise and professional relationships in the industry I'd once planned to make my career. He'd kept me ignorant not just of my wealth, but of my professional possibilities. I fell asleep that night surrounded by financial reports and strategic planning documents, dreaming about aircraft and flight routes and board meetings where I finally had a voice in decisions about my own inheritance. Derek's abandonment at the airport had been intended to remind me of my limitations and dependence. Instead, It had accidentally forced me to confront the reality of my power and independence. Monday morning arrived with Colorado's characteristic, brilliant sunshine and mountain air that made everything feel possible. I dressed carefully for my first board meeting, choosing a navy suit that projected professional competence without trying too hard to impress. Looking in the mirror, I tried to see myself as the controlling owner of a major regional airline, rather than the abandoned wife who'd been stranded at the airport 36 hours earlier. The drive to Summit Airways headquarters took me through industrial areas near Denver International Airport that I'd seen countless times without realizing I had any connection to the businesses housed there. The company occupied a modern 3-story building with large windows overlooking aircraft, maintenance hangars, and cargo facilities. A discreet sign near the entrance read, Summit Airways Corporate Offices, in elegant letters that somehow made the whole situation feel more real. Marcus met me in the lobby along with 3 people I'd never seen before, but who'd been managing my inheritance for over a decade. Helen Blackwood, the chief financial officer, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd joined Summit Airways during Dad's final years. Thomas Rodriguez, the operations director, had started as a pilot with the company and worked his way up through management ranks. Diana Foster, the marketing and customer service director, was younger than the others, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd proven her expertise through results, rather than seniority. Victoria, it's wonderful to finally meet you properly, Helen said as we shook hands. Your father spoke about you constantly during my early years with the company. He was so proud of your interest in aviation and so excited about the possibility of you joining the business eventually. The warmth in her voice carried genuine emotion, and I realized these people had been hoping for this meeting as much as Marcus had. They'd been running my company competently, but without the guidance and strategic vision that ownership should provide. My absence hadn't just been a missed opportunity for me. It had limited their ability to pursue ambitious plans for Summit Airways growth. I have to apologize for being so disconnected from the company's operations, I said as we walked toward the conference room. I'm embarrassed to admit I didn't fully understand my role or responsibilities until yesterday afternoon. Thomas exchanged a glance with the others that suggested they'd discussed my long absence many times. We assumed you were busy with other priorities, he said diplomatically. Young people often need time to explore different paths before settling into family business responsibilities. The conference room overlooked the aircraft maintenance facility, where I could see Summit Airways planes in the company's distinctive Mountain Peak livery being serviced by ground crews. The sight of those aircraft, bearing the logo Dad had designed and operating under the company name he'd chosen, made my connection to this business feel tangible for the first time. Diana had prepared a comprehensive presentation about Summit Airways' current operations, financial performance, and strategic opportunities. As she walked through slides showing route maps, passenger statistics, and revenue projections, I found myself asking questions that surprised even me with their sophistication. The business knowledge I'd gained in college and the industry insights I'd absorbed during childhood visits with Dad hadn't disappeared. They'd just been dormant, waiting for an opportunity to be relevant again. Our passenger satisfaction ratings consistently exceed industry averages, Diana explained, showing comparative charts. We've built a reputation for reliable service and customer-focused policies that larger carriers have difficulty matching. That's been our competitive advantage, but it also creates opportunities for expansion if we can maintain service quality while adding routes and aircraft. Helen pulled out financial projections showing 3 growth scenarios. Conservative expansion would involve adding 6 aircraft over the next 3 years and increasing frequency on our most profitable routes. Moderate expansion would add 12 aircraft and extend service to new cities in California and Texas. Aggressive expansion would position us for acquisition by a major carrier at maximum valuation. I studied the numbers, recognizing that each scenario represented not just business decisions, but choices about what kind of future I wanted to build. Conservative expansion would provide steady income while preserving the regional character. Dad had envisioned for Summit Airways. Aggressive expansion would maximize financial returns, but might sacrifice the company's independence and customer service culture. "What's your recommendation?" I asked, looking around the table at people who'd been thinking about these decisions for years while waiting for ownership input. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "Victoria, we've been conservative because we didn't know your risk tolerance or vision for the company. But honestly, Summit Airways has opportunities right now that might not exist in 5 years. The regional aviation market is consolidating, and companies our size either need to grow aggressively or risk being squeezed out by larger competitors. The Alaska Airlines acquisition offer represents immediate financial security," Helen added. $30 million would set you up for life without any business risks or management responsibilities. But if you're interested in active involvement, we believe Summit Airways could be worth twice that amount within a decade. I thought about Derek's text messages from Miami, his condescending assumption that I'd be grateful for his forgiveness when he returned from his business conference. He'd built his consulting career on the foundation of my inherited wealth, while ensuring I remained ignorant of my own resources and capabilities. The irony of his situation was almost funny. He was attending a conference about business strategy, while his abandoned wife was making strategic decisions about a company worth more than anything he'd ever managed. "I want to pursue moderate expansion," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I want to grow Summit Airways while preserving what made Dad's vision special. But I also want to be actively involved in management decisions going forward. I've been absent from this company for too long." The relief and excitement around the conference table was palpable. Helen immediately began pulling out expansion plans they'd developed but never implemented. Thomas started discussing aircraft acquisition strategies and pilot recruitment needs. Diana outlined marketing approaches for new routes and customer retention programs. As we discussed implementation timelines and budget allocations, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of using my intelligence and education for purposes that mattered to me. Derek had gradually convinced me that my business knowledge was theoretical and irrelevant, that my role was to support his career rather than develop my own expertise. Sitting in that conference room, making decisions about aircraft purchases and route expansion, I remembered why I'd once been excited about joining Dad's company. "There's one more thing we should discuss," Marcus said as the meeting began to wind down. "Victoria, your increased involvement with Summit Airways will require some changes to your personal financial arrangements. As an active business owner, rather than a passive beneficiary, you'll need independent banking, separate business accounts, and professional management of your expanded income streams." The implications of what he was suggesting hit me immediately. Independent banking meant Derek would no longer have access to my financial information. Separate business accounts meant he couldn't monitor or control my spending. Professional management of expanded income meant I'd have resources that were completely outside his knowledge or influence. "I want to set up completely independent financial arrangements," I said firmly. "Derek shouldn't have access to any information about Summit Airways or my involvement with the company. I need complete financial privacy while I figure out my next steps." Helen nodded approvingly. "We can arrange for direct deposits into new accounts and ensure all business correspondence goes to a private address. Your involvement with Summit Airways can be as discreet or public as you choose." As the meeting concluded and we scheduled follow-up sessions for the rest of the week, I realized Derek's abandonment had accomplished something he'd never intended. He'd forced me to rediscover my own capabilities and resources. He'd accidentally triggered my reconnection with Dad's legacy and my own professional potential. Most importantly, he'd given me the motivation to reclaim parts of my identity I'd abandoned years ago. The trustees walked me through Summit Airways facility after our meeting, showing me aircraft maintenance operations, customer service centers, and pilot training facilities. Watching the complex choreography of airline operations, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial returns. This was Dad's legacy, but it was also becoming mine. Derek had tried to teach me about dependence and limitation. Instead, he'd accidentally reminded me that I was capable of far more than he'd ever allowed me to believe. That afternoon, I opened new bank accounts, established a private mailing address, and began the process of creating financial independence. Derek couldn't monitor or control. The woman he'd abandoned at the airport was disappearing, replaced by someone who owned an airline and had plans for its future. Derek thought he was teaching me a lesson about my limitations. He was about to discover that his greatest limitation was underestimating his wife. The transformation began Tuesday morning when I walked into Summit Airways headquarters, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that had been gathering dust in my closet for years. The confidence I felt wasn't manufactured or forced. It came from understanding that I belonged in that building, that every decision made there ultimately required my approval, and that the people working throughout those offices were implementing strategies for a company I owned. Helen Blackwood was waiting in the lobby with a stack of contracts and acquisition proposals that required my signature. Over the past 24 hours, she'd been working with Marcus to expedite the financial independence arrangements we'd discussed, and the speed with which everything was falling into place felt almost surreal. By noon today, I would have private banking accounts that Derek couldn't access, a business credit line that gave me complete financial autonomy, and legal documentation establishing my active role in Summit Airways management. The aircraft. Acquisition agreements are ready for your review, Helen said as we walked toward the executive conference room. Thomas has negotiated excellent terms with Boeing for 6 new 737 MAX aircraft, with delivery scheduled over the next 18 months. The expansion routes Diana has proposed will require these additional planes to maintain our service frequency standards. I settled into the chair at the head of the conference table, a position that felt both natural and revolutionary. For 15 years, I'd been Derek's wife, Derek's +1, Derek's supportive partner who smiled and nodded while he made decisions about our life. Now I was Victoria Hayes, majority owner of Summit Airways, making strategic choices that would affect 1,200 employees and hundreds of thousands of passengers annually. The contracts Helen spread before me represented $38 million in aircraft purchases, route expansion investments, and facility upgrades. The numbers that would have seemed impossibly large just days ago now felt like reasonable business expenses for a company generating the revenue Summit Airways produced. Derek's consulting contracts, which I'd always thought of as our primary income source, were actually tiny compared to the financial flows I was now managing. Diana, walk me through the new route proposals again, I said, studying maps that showed Summit Airways' current service areas alongside projected expansion corridors. I want to understand the passenger demand data and competitive analysis for each new destination. Diana's presentation was thorough and impressive, demonstrating market research capabilities that rivaled anything Derek's consulting firm produced. She'd identified underserved routes where Summit Airways could establish profitable service before larger carriers recognized the opportunities. The expansion plan was aggressive, but carefully calculated, designed to grow our market share while maintaining the customer service standards that differentiated us from major airlines. The Phoenix to Bozeman route has particularly strong potential, Diana explained, pointing to demographic data showing increased migration patterns between Arizona and Montana. United and Southwest both discontinued service on this corridor during the pandemic, but passenger demand has recovered to pre-2020 levels. We could establish dominance on this route before larger carriers decide to resume service. I found myself asking detailed questions about load factors, seasonal variations, and pricing strategies that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. The business knowledge I'd thought was outdated turned out to be more relevant than I'd realized. Aviation fundamentals hadn't changed dramatically over the past 15 years, and my economics background gave me analytical tools that applied directly to current market conditions. Thomas Rodriguez joined our discussion with operational details about crew scheduling, maintenance requirements, and airport slot availability for the proposed routes. His expertise was impressive, but what struck me most was his obvious respect for my input and decision-making authority. These weren't people humoring the owner's wife or patronizing a figurehead. They were experienced professionals treating me as the business leader I was legally entitled to be. The pilot recruitment situation is competitive right now, Thomas explained, showing me industry data about aviator shortages affecting regional carriers. But Summit Airways has advantages in recruiting and retention. Our safety record, equipment quality, and company culture attract experienced pilots who want alternatives to major airline employment. I thought about Derek's dismissive comments about my aviation knowledge while listening to Thomas discuss complex operational challenges I understood intuitively. The irony was becoming more apparent every hour. Derek had mocked my business expertise while building his career on income generated by a company he couldn't have managed himself. His consulting work involved advising clients about strategic decisions far simpler than the choices I was making about aircraft acquisitions and route development. My phone buzzed with another message from Derek, this time including photos from his Miami conference. Networking reception last night was excellent for business development. Wish you could have seen how impressed potential clients were with my market analysis presentation. Maybe next time you'll appreciate these professional opportunities. The condescending tone that once would have made me feel guilty and small now seemed pathetic rather than intimidating. Derek was sending photos of himself schmoozing with potential consulting clients, while his abandoned wife was signing contracts worth more than his annual revenue. He had no idea that I was building business relationships and making strategic decisions that dwarfed anything he'd ever managed. Victoria, there's something else we should discuss, Helen said as we finished reviewing the expansion contracts. Your increased involvement with Summit Airways creates some interesting opportunities for tax optimization and estate planning. With proper structuring, we can minimize your tax liability while maximizing the company's growth potential. We spent the next hour with Summit Airways' accounting team discussing financial structures I'd never known existed. Employee stock ownership plans, investment tax credits for aircraft purchases, depreciation schedules that improved cash flow, and profit-sharing arrangements that would benefit the entire company while reducing my personal tax burden. The complexity was fascinating rather than overwhelming, and I found myself understanding concepts Derek had never bothered to explain during our marriage. The key advantage of active business ownership versus passive investment income is the control you have over timing and structure, Helen explained. Derek has been receiving your dividend payments as ordinary income, which means you've been paying higher tax rates than necessary. With active management involvement, we can restructure everything more efficiently. The mention of Derek's role in handling my dividend payments brought a fresh wave of anger about the scope of his deception. He hadn't just been intercepting my mail and hiding information about Summit Airways. He'd been mismanaging my tax obligations and costing me money through inefficient financial arrangements. Every aspect of our shared financial life had been structured to benefit him while keeping me ignorant of better alternatives. After lunch, Thomas took me on a comprehensive tour of Summit Airways' operational facilities. Walking through aircraft maintenance hangars where technicians worked on the planes that generated my wealth felt like stepping into a world that should have been familiar years ago. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, the sound of pneumatic tools and radio communications, the sight of aircraft being prepared for service, all of it felt like coming home to a place I'd never properly visited. Your father insisted on maintaining our own maintenance facilities rather than contracting those services to third parties, Thomas explained, as we watched technicians performing routine inspections on a Boeing 737. It's more expensive initially, but it gives us complete control over safety standards and turnaround times. That control has been crucial to our reliability reputation. I thought about Dad's business philosophy while watching the careful, methodical work happening throughout the maintenance facility. He'd built Summit Airways on principles of quality and reliability rather than cost-cutting and profit maximization. The employees working on those aircraft took obvious pride in their work, and the facility itself reflected investment in long-term sustainability rather than short-term financial gains. How do our employees feel about ownership changes? I asked Thomas as we walked through the customer service center where representatives handled reservations and passenger assistance. Has my absence from company management been a concern for staff? Thomas chose his words carefully. People have wondered about succession planning and long-term stability. Your father built strong loyalty among employees, but there's been uncertainty about whether his vision would continue after his death. Your active involvement resolves those concerns and provides continuity people have been hoping for. The customer service center buzzed with activity as representatives handled booking changes, flight delays, and passenger inquiries with efficiency and genuine helpfulness that contrasted sharply with the automated systems larger airlines used. Listening to those conversations, I understood why Summit Airways maintained higher customer satisfaction ratings despite serving smaller markets than major carriers. Diana joined us for the final portion of the facility tour, walking through the marketing department where teams developed advertising campaigns and managed corporate partnerships that promoted Summit Airways throughout the Mountain West region. The creative work was sophisticated and targeted, focusing on the airline's reliability and regional connections, rather than trying to compete with major carriers on price alone. We've been conservative about expansion marketing because we didn't want to overcommit without ownership approval, Diana explained, showing me campaign concepts they'd developed but never implemented. With your support for growth initiatives, we can launch more aggressive customer acquisition programs and establish Summit Airways as the preferred regional carrier for business and leisure travelers. By late afternoon, I'd signed contracts worth $43 million, approved expansion plans that would increase Summit Airways' fleet by 30%, and established myself as an active participant in strategic decisions that would shape the company's future for the next decade. The woman Derek had abandoned at the airport was nowhere to be found. She'd been replaced by someone who owned an airline and understood exactly how to use that ownership effectively. The psychological transformation was as significant as the business decisions. For 15 years, I'd measured my worth by Derek's approval and defined my success by his achievements. Now I was making choices based on my own judgment and taking responsibility for outcomes that would affect thousands of people. The confidence wasn't borrowed or dependent on someone else's validation. It came from understanding my own capabilities and resources. Marcus called as I was preparing to leave Summit Airways headquarters, his voice carrying excitement about developments that had occurred while I'd been focused on operational decisions. Victoria, I've had interesting conversations today with representatives from Alaska Airlines and United. Word is getting around the industry that Summit Airways has new ownership involvement, and both companies want to schedule meetings about potential partnership opportunities. The timing of those inquiries wasn't coincidental. Aviation industry networks were notoriously tight, and news about ownership changes traveled quickly among executives and analysts who tracked regional carrier activities. My emergence as an active participant in Summit Airways management had apparently triggered immediate interest from major airlines looking for partnership or acquisition opportunities. What kind of partnerships are they proposing? I asked, settling into my car in the Summit Airways parking lot while aircraft taxied toward runways in the distance. Code-sharing agreements, route coordination, possibly joint marketing initiatives, Marcus replied. But Victoria, I suspect these conversations are also exploratory for potential acquisition discussions. Your involvement has probably signaled to the industry that Summit Airways might be open to strategic alternatives. I thought about the acquisition offers Helen had shown me, proposals worth $30 million or more that would allow me to walk away from business responsibilities, with enough wealth to fund any lifestyle I chose. The financial security was appealing, but something about the idea of selling Dad's company felt premature. I'd just rediscovered my connection to Summit Airways and begun to understand my own capabilities as a business owner. Schedule preliminary meetings with both companies, I decided. I want to understand their proposals, but I'm not committed to any particular outcome. Summit Airways has value as an independent company, and I want to explore all our strategic options before making long-term decisions. As I drove home that evening, I thought about Derek's return from Miami, scheduled for Thursday afternoon. He'd left believing he was teaching me a lesson about dependence and limitation. He'd returned to discover I'd spent the week taking control of a multi-million-dollar company and making strategic decisions about its future. The reversal was so complete I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but not quite. Derek's cruelty at the airport had been calculated and deliberate, designed to humiliate me and reinforce his control over our relationship. The systematic deception about my inheritance had been equally deliberate, intended to keep me financially dependent and ignorant of my own resources. He'd stolen 12 years of potential involvement with Dad's legacy, 12 years of professional development and business ownership that I could never recover. The house felt different when I walked through the front door that evening. The carefully decorated rooms that had always seemed like evidence of Derek's success now looked like a stage set, where I'd been performing a role that wasn't authentic. I belonged in Summit Airways conference rooms making strategic decisions, not in this suburban living room waiting for Derek to return from business trips and tell me about opportunities I wasn't qualified to understand. I spent the evening reviewing market analysis reports Diana had prepared, studying passenger demand projections and competitive landscape assessments that would inform our expansion decisions. The work was intellectually engaging in ways that organizing charity fundraisers and hosting dinner parties had never been. I was using my education and analytical capabilities for purposes that created value rather than just maintaining social appearances. My phone rang around 9 o'clock with a call from Helen, who'd been working late to finalize the financial arrangements we'd discussed. "Victoria, everything is set up for tomorrow morning. You'll have complete financial independence, business credit facilities, and private banking relationships that give you total control over your resources. Derek won't have access to any information about your Summit Airways involvement or expanded income." The satisfaction I felt hearing those words was profound. Financial independence meant more than just having money. It meant having choices. Derek couldn't influence or control. I could make decisions about my future without considering his approval or managing his reactions. The power dynamic in our marriage had shifted completely, even though he didn't know it yet. "There's one more thing," Helen continued. "The media relations firm we use for Summit Airways has been getting inquiries from aviation industry publications about your increased involvement with the company. Apparently, news travels fast in airline circles. How do you want to handle press attention?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered that my emergence as an active business owner might attract media attention beyond industry publications. Summit Airways was significant enough in regional aviation markets that ownership changes would be newsworthy, especially given Dad's reputation as an industry pioneer and my long absence from company management. Let's keep media exposure minimal. For now, I decided. I want to establish myself operationally before dealing with external publicity. But Helen, make sure any press coverage emphasizes my role as owner and strategic decision-maker, not as someone's wife who inherited a business. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just 3 days. Derek's abandonment at the airport had been intended to remind me of my limitations and dependence. Instead, it had forced me to confront the reality of my capabilities and resources. I'd rediscovered professional interests I'd abandoned, reconnected with Dad's legacy, and begun building a future that belonged entirely to me. Derek was scheduled to return from Miami tomorrow afternoon, expecting to find a chastened wife grateful for his forgiveness and ready to apologize for whatever character flaws had led to our airport confrontation. Instead, he'd find a woman who owned an airline, had spent the week making strategic business decisions, and possessed financial independence he couldn't monitor or control. The lesson he'd intended to teach about dependence and limitation was about to become a lesson about consequences and accountability. Derek had never imagined that abandoning me at the airport would trigger my awakening as a business owner and my reclamation of resources he'd been hiding for over a decade. His cruel gesture of control was about to become the catalyst for his complete loss of power over my life. Wednesday morning brought news that accelerated everything. Thomas called while I was having coffee and reviewing expansion route proposals, his voice carrying urgency about developments that had occurred overnight. "Victoria, we've received a formal partnership proposal from Alaska Airlines that's significantly more aggressive than their previous inquiries. They want to schedule a meeting this week to discuss immediate opportunities." The timing felt suspicious, and I wondered if industry networks had been buzzing with speculation about Summit Airways' new ownership activity. Major airlines employed analysts who tracked regional carrier performance and ownership changes, looking for acquisition opportunities or partnership possibilities that could enhance their route networks. "What kind of partnership are they proposing?" I asked, setting aside the route analysis I'd been reviewing. "Code sharing on all our Mountain West routes, joint marketing initiatives, and shared frequent flyer programs," Thomas replied. "But, Victoria, the financial terms they're suggesting look more like acquisition preliminary discussions than partnership negotiations. I think they're testing whether you might be interested in selling Summit Airways." The implications were significant. If Alaska Airlines was seriously interested in acquiring Summit Airways, their offer would likely exceed the $30 million figure Marcus had mentioned. Major carriers were paying premium valuations for regional airlines with established route networks and customer bases, especially companies like Summit Airways that had maintained profitability and operational excellence. "Schedule the meeting for Friday morning," I decided. "I want to understand their full proposal, but I also want them to understand they're dealing with an engaged owner who has strategic alternatives." As I drove to Summit Airways headquarters for my third consecutive day of business meetings, I thought about Derek's return scheduled for that afternoon. He'd spent the week in Miami networking with potential consulting clients, building relationships he hoped would expand his practice. Meanwhile, I'd been negotiating aircraft acquisitions worth more than his lifetime earning potential and fielding partnership proposals from major airlines. The irony was becoming more delicious by the hour. Derek had abandoned me at the airport to teach me about my limitations and dependence. Instead, he'd accidentally triggered my emergence as a business owner with resources and opportunities that dwarfed anything he'd ever managed. His lesson about independence was about to become a demonstration of exactly how independent I'd become. Thursday afternoon arrived with Colorado's characteristic autumn sunshine and crisp mountain air that made everything feel possible. I was in the Summit Airways conference room reviewing Alaska Airlines' partnership proposal when Marcus called to inform me that Derek's flight from Miami had landed at Denver International Airport. After 4 days of business meetings, strategic planning, and financial independence arrangements, I was about to face the man who'd tried to teach me a lesson about dependence and limitation. The woman he'd abandoned at the airport was gone, replaced by someone who owned an airline and understood exactly how to use that power. Derek's cruel lesson was about to become his own education about consequences and accountability. He'd never imagined that his gesture of control would become the catalyst for his complete loss of influence over my life and future. Derek's rental car pulled into our driveway at precisely 4:30 Thursday afternoon, the same silver sedan he'd driven to the airport 4 days earlier when he'd believed he was teaching me an important lesson about dependence. I watched from the kitchen window as he gathered his luggage and briefcase, moving with the confident stride of someone who expected to find a properly chastened wife, waiting to apologize for whatever character defects had led to our unfortunate disagreement. He had no idea that the woman he'd abandoned at Denver International Airport no longer existed, replaced by someone who'd spent the week signing contracts worth $43 million and fielding acquisition inquiries from major airlines. The financial independence he'd been systematically hiding from me was now completely under my control. managed through private banking relationships he couldn't access or monitor. I heard his key in the front door lock, followed by the familiar sound of his briefcase hitting the entryway table and his travel bag being dropped beside the stairs. "Victoria?" he called, his voice carrying the slightly imperious tone he used when he expected immediate attention. "I'm home. We need to talk about what happened at the airport." "I'm in the kitchen," I replied, my voice steady and calm in ways that would have surprised me 4 days ago. The woman who'd stood frozen in that boarding area while Derek disappeared down the jet bridge had been replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was worth and what she was capable of accomplishing. Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing the casual but expensive travel outfit I recognized from countless business trips, his expression combining practiced concern with underlying irritation. He'd clearly prepared a speech during his flight from Miami, something about partnership and mutual respect that would allow him to appear magnanimous while reinforcing his control over our relationship dynamics. "Victoria, I've had time to think about our disagreement, and I realize we both said things we regret," he began, settling into the breakfast nook chair he always preferred. "I shouldn't have left you at the airport like that. It was immature and unnecessary. But I hope you understand that your behavior was also problematic. Questioning my professional expertise in public, undermining my confidence before an important presentation." I listened to his carefully rehearsed apology while studying his face, looking for any sign that he suspected how completely his world had shifted during his absence. He showed no awareness that I'd discovered the systematic deception he'd been maintaining about my inheritance, no concern that I might have used his abandonment as motivation to investigate financial arrangements he'd been controlling without my knowledge. "I accept your apology about the airport," I said carefully, watching his expression brighten as he interpreted my response as capitulation. "You're right that leaving me stranded was immature and unnecessary. But Derek, I don't regret questioning your professional expertise. In fact, I think my business judgment has been more accurate than you've given me credit for." His smile faltered slightly at my qualification, but he pressed forward with what was obviously a prepared reconciliation script. "Victoria, I know you feel like I don't value your opinions, but that's not true. It's just that business strategy is my area of expertise. You've been focused on other priorities for so many years that you might not realize how much the corporate world has changed." Ooh! The condescension in his tone was so familiar I almost laughed. Derek was literally explaining business strategy to the majority owner of a $47 million airline company, dismissing my professional capabilities while sitting in a kitchen paid for with income generated by the inheritance he'd been hiding from me for over a decade. "Actually, Derek, I've been doing some research while you were in Miami," I said, opening my laptop on the kitchen table. "I've learned some interesting things about business strategy and corporate finance that I think you'll find educational." He leaned back in his chair with the indulgent expression he used when I showed him charity fundraising proposals or neighborhood improvement plans, clearly expecting to humor my amateur attempts at business analysis before steering the conversation back to his professional expertise. "That's wonderful, Victoria. I'm glad you've been keeping yourself busy. What kind of research have you been doing?" I turned the laptop screen toward him, displaying the Summit Airways financial reports Marcus had provided. Derek's expression remained politely interested until he began processing the company name and revenue figures, at which point his face went through a fascinating series of changes as understanding dawned. "Derek, meet Summit Airways, the airline company I inherited from my father. According to these financial statements, it's currently valued at approximately $47 million, which makes my majority ownership stake worth about $27 million. Interestingly, the company has been generating substantial dividend payments that have been deposited into our joint checking account for the past 12 years. The color drained from Derek's face as he stared at financial reports that revealed the scope of what he'd been hiding. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, like someone trying to process information that contradicted everything he'd told himself about our relationship and his role in our marriage. "Victoria, I can explain about the financial arrangements, he finally managed, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The trustee situation was complicated, and I didn't want to burden you with complex business details while you were grieving your father's death. I was protecting you from unnecessary stress. Protecting me? I replied, letting genuine amusement color my voice. Derek, you've been collecting dividend payments from my airline company for 12 years while convincing me I was financially dependent on your consulting income. You've been intercepting my mail, hiding my inheritance, and allowing me to believe I needed your economic support while you were actually living off my family's wealth. Derek's expression shifted from shock to defensive anger as he realized the extent of what I'd discovered. That's not fair, Victoria. I've been managing our finances responsibly, making sure we had stable income and proper investments. You never showed any interest in the business details, so I handled them for both of us. You handled them by ensuring I remained ignorant of my own resources, I countered. You deliberately prevented me from understanding that I owned a successful company, that I had financial independence, that I could make choices about my future without considering your approval or preferences. He stood up abruptly, pacing toward the kitchen window with the agitated energy of someone whose carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. Victoria, you're making this sound more sinister than it actually was. Yes, I managed the financial details, but that was for our mutual benefit. Do you think you would have been happy dealing with quarterly reports and board meetings and all the stress that comes with business ownership? I don't know, Derek, because you never gave me the opportunity to find out, I replied. But interestingly, I've spent this week attending board meetings and reviewing quarterly reports, and I found the experience quite satisfying. Much more intellectually engaging than organizing charity fundraisers or hosting dinner parties. For your colleagues. Derek spun around to face me, his expression alarmed. What do you mean you've been attending board meetings? Victoria, please tell me you haven't made any major financial decisions while you were upset about our airport disagreement. The patronizing tone he used when discussing my emotional stability was so familiar, I'd stopped noticing it years ago. But now it struck me as both insulting and pathetic. Derek was genuinely concerned that I might have used my own financial resources to make decisions about my own company without his guidance and approval. Actually, Derek, I've made several major financial decisions this week. I've approved a $43 million expansion plan that includes purchasing 6 new aircraft and establishing service to 12 additional cities. I've also been fielding acquisition inquiries from Alaska Airlines and United, both of whom are interested in partnership opportunities that could significantly increase Summit Airways' valuation. Derek stared at me with the horrified expression of someone watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Victoria, you can't make decisions like that without proper analysis and professional consultation. $43 million? Do you have any idea what kind of risk exposure that creates? Less risk exposure than you'd face with any consulting contract you've ever handled, I replied calmly. Derek, Summit Airways generated over $8 million in revenue last year. The expansion investments I've approved represent less than 6 months of current cash flow. These aren't reckless decisions. They're strategic investments based on comprehensive market analysis and operational planning. I could see him struggling to process the financial scale of what I was describing. Derek's consulting practice generated perhaps $200,000 annually in good years, and his largest client contracts involved advisory services worth tens of thousands of dollars. The idea that I was making business decisions involving millions of dollars clearly challenged his fundamental assumptions about our relative capabilities and resources. Victoria, I think you need to slow down and consider the implications of what you're doing, he said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. These kinds of business decisions require experience and expertise you simply don't have. Maybe we should schedule a meeting with a financial advisor who can help you understand the risks involved. I've been working with Marcus Chen, Dad's longtime attorney, along with Summit Airways' executive team, I replied. Helen Blackwood, the chief financial officer, has over 20 years of aviation industry experience. Thomas Rodriguez, the operations director, started as a pilot and worked his way up through airline management. Diana Foster handles marketing and customer relations for a company that maintains higher satisfaction ratings than United or Southwest. Derek's expression grew more alarmed as I listed credentials that exceeded anything he could claim in his own consulting practice. Victoria, I'm sure these people are competent, but you need independent advisors who aren't invested in expanding their own business opportunities. You need someone looking out for your interests specifically. My interests specifically? I repeated, allowing skepticism to color my voice. Derek, my interests include owning a successful airline company, making strategic decisions about its future, and benefiting from the wealth and opportunities that ownership provides. Exactly which of those interests do you think I should be reconsidering? He began pacing again, his agitation more pronounced as he grappled with the reality that I'd discovered resources and capabilities he'd been systematically hiding. Victoria, ownership comes with responsibilities and liabilities you might not fully understand. What if the expansion plans fail? What if the new routes don't generate sufficient passenger demand? What if there's an economic downturn that affects the aviation industry? Then I'll deal with those challenges using the same business judgment I've been applying to approve profitable strategies, I replied. Derek, Summit Airways has been successful for over 25 years, including through multiple economic downturns and industry disruptions. The management team has proven expertise in navigating operational challenges and maintaining profitability, even during difficult periods. Derek stopped pacing and faced me directly, his expression shifting to the manipulative concern he used when he wanted to convince me I was making emotional rather than rational decisions. Victoria, I'm worried about you. This sudden interest in business management, these major financial commitments, this whole dramatic change in behavior. Are you sure you're not reacting emotionally to our airport disagreement rather than making sound strategic choices? The psychological manipulation was so transparent I almost admired its audacity. Derek was attempting to convince me that discovering my own inheritance and taking control of my financial future represented some kind of emotional breakdown rather than long overdue empowerment. He was suggesting that making informed business decisions about my own company indicated instability rather than competence. Derek, the only thing I'm reacting to emotionally is discovering that you've been deceiving me about my own financial situation for over a decade, I said firmly. Everything else represents rational strategic planning based on comprehensive business analysis and professional consultation. His expression hardened as he realized that psychological manipulation wasn't going to restore his control over the situation. Victoria, regardless of whatever technical ownership you might have, you don't have the experience or knowledge to make complex business decisions independently. You're going to need guidance and support, and I'm the person best positioned to provide that. Actually, Derek, I've been making complex business decisions quite successfully this week without your guidance or support, I replied. In fact, I've been wondering why I ever thought I needed your input on financial matters when my business judgment has proven more accurate than yours. More accurate than mine? Derek's voice rose with indignation. Victoria, I've built a successful consulting practice from nothing. I have MBA training and 15 years of professional experience. You took some economics courses in college and then spent the next decade and a half organizing social events. I spent the next decade and a half supporting your career while you lived off income generated by my airline company, I corrected. Derek, every dollar you've invested, every business opportunity you've pursued, every professional achievement you've celebrated has been subsidized by wealth you convinced me I didn't possess. The accusation hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time since returning from Miami, Derek looked genuinely shaken rather than merely frustrated. He'd built his professional identity around being the successful partner in our marriage, the strategic thinker whose expertise guided our financial decisions and whose achievements provided our comfortable lifestyle. That's not fair, Victoria. Yes, the dividend income has been helpful, but I've built my consulting practice through my own efforts and expertise. My clients hire me because of my analytical capabilities and strategic insights, not because of your family's airline company. Your clients hire you because you can afford to charge competitive rates and invest in business development activities funded by my inheritance, I replied. Derek, how much of your consulting income over the past 5 years has gone toward business expenses versus how much has been supplemented by Summit Airways dividends? Derek's silence was answer enough. His consulting practice had been profitable partly because he could afford to operate at lower margins than competitors who didn't have external income sources. He'd been able to invest in marketing and client development activities that his consulting fees alone wouldn't have supported. Victoria, even if the financial arrangements have been beneficial, that doesn't invalidate my professional expertise or my role in building our life together, he said, attempting to salvage some foundation for continued influence. We're partners, and partners make major decisions collaboratively rather than unilaterally. Partners share information honestly and make decisions based on mutual respect rather than deliberate deception, I countered. Derek, you've spent 12 years ensuring I remained ignorant of my own resources while using those resources to subsidize your career. That's not partnership. That's exploitation. His expression shifted to anger as the full implications of his situation became apparent. Victoria, if you think you can just cut me out of financial decisions and business planning, you're mistaken. We're married, which creates legal obligations and shared responsibilities regardless of whose name appears on corporate ownership documents. Actually, Derek, I've been consulting with attorneys about exactly those legal obligations and shared responsibilities, I replied calmly. Interestingly, my ownership of Summit Airways predates our marriage, which means it's separate property under Colorado law. The dividend income that's been deposited into our joint account could be considered marital property, but the underlying business assets remain mine exclusively. Derek stared at me with growing alarm as he realized I'd been thinking strategically about legal protections as well as business opportunities. Victoria, what exactly are you suggesting? Are you threatening divorce because of a disagreement about financial management? I'm not threatening anything, Derek. I'm simply clarifying the legal realities of our situation now that I understand what my actual financial position is. You wanted to teach me about independence and self-reliance. Consider this my graduation. Exercise. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on our suburban street. Derek stood near the window staring out at the neighborhood where we'd built what I'd thought was a partnership, but now understood had been a carefully orchestrated system of control and dependency. Victoria, I think we both need time to process. What's happened this week? He said finally, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Maybe we should postpone any major decisions until we've had a chance to discuss everything more calmly. I've been making decisions quite calmly, Derek. In fact, I have another board meeting tomorrow morning to finalize the Alaska Airlines partnership discussions. I'll be interested to hear their formal acquisition proposal, though I'm leaning toward maintaining Summit Airways' independence while expanding our strategic alliances. Derek's expression shifted through several emotions as he processed the implications of what I'd just said. An acquisition proposal from Alaska Airlines would likely exceed $30 million, which would give me financial independence beyond anything he could influence or control. My preference for maintaining independence while expanding strategic alliances suggested I was thinking long-term about business ownership rather than seeking quick financial exits. You're really going to continue with this business involvement? He asked, and for the first time since returning from Miami, his voice carried uncertainty rather than confidence. Derek, this isn't temporary involvement motivated by our airport disagreement, I replied. This is me reclaiming a legacy I should never have abandoned and taking control of resources I should never have allowed you to manage without my knowledge. As Derek retreated upstairs to unpack his luggage, I remained in the kitchen, reviewing Alaska Airlines' preliminary partnership proposal on my laptop. The terms were generous, reflecting their recognition that Summit Airways represented valuable strategic assets in markets they wanted to penetrate. Whether I accepted their acquisition offer or used it as leverage for better partnership terms, I now had options Derek couldn't influence or control. The transformation that had begun with his abandonment at the airport was accelerating beyond anything he could have anticipated. Derek had intended to teach me about limitation and dependence. Instead, he'd accidentally triggered my awakening. As a business owner with resources and capabilities that dwarfed his own professional achievements, tomorrow's meeting with Alaska Airlines would determine whether I continued building Summit Airways as an independent regional carrier or accepted an acquisition offer that would provide immediate financial security beyond Derek's ability to influence. Either choice would be mine to make based on my own strategic judgment and professional consultation with people who respected my decision-making authority. Derek's lesson about independence was nearly complete, though the final examination would be his rather than mine. He'd spent 15 years believing he was the dominant partner in our marriage, the successful professional whose expertise guided our major decisions. Now he'd discovered that his achievements had been subsidized by wealth belonging to a wife. He'd systematically underestimated and financially controlled. The woman he'd abandoned at Denver International Airport had been replaced by someone who owned an airline and understood exactly how to use that ownership effectively. Derek's cruel gesture of control had become the catalyst for his complete loss of influence over my life and future. His lesson about dependence was about to become his own education about consequences and accountability. Friday morning arrived with the crisp October air that made Denver feel alive with possibility. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Alaska Airlines executives, choosing a navy power suit that projected confidence without appearing overly aggressive. The woman looking back at me from the bedroom mirror bore little resemblance to the abandoned wife who'd stood helplessly in the airport boarding area just 5 days ago. This woman owned a $47 million airline company and was about to negotiate with one of the largest carriers in North America. Derek had left early for what he claimed was an important client meeting, though I suspected he needed time away from the house to process the reality of his dramatically altered circumstances. His departure meant I could prepare for the Alaska Airlines meeting without managing his anxiety about decisions being made beyond his control or influence. The drive to Summit Airways headquarters felt different today, carrying the weight of choices that would determine my company's future direction and my own role in the aviation industry Dad had loved. Thomas Rodriguez met me in the lobby with news that had arrived overnight, his expression combining excitement with professional caution. "Victoria, Alaska Airlines requested to move the meeting to Denver International Airport," he said as we walked toward the executive conference room. They want to conduct negotiations in one of their corporate lounges, which suggests they're treating this as a high-priority strategic opportunity. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Derek had abandoned me at Denver International Airport believing he was demonstrating my helplessness and dependence. Now I would return to that same airport as the owner of an airline company, negotiating partnership terms with executives who viewed Summit Airways as a valuable strategic asset. Helen Blackwood and Diana Foster joined us for the drive to DIA, both carrying files containing financial projections and competitive analyses that would inform our negotiating strategy. The mood in the car was focused but optimistic, reflecting confidence that Summit Airways held strong bargaining positions regardless of whether we pursued partnership arrangements or acquisition discussions. The key advantage we have is that Alaska Airlines needs access to our Mountain West route network more than we need their partnership, Helen explained as we navigated morning traffic toward the airport. They've been trying to establish profitable service to smaller markets like Aspen, Jackson Hole, and Park City, but they lack the regional expertise and customer relationships we've developed over decades. Diana nodded in agreement. Our passenger loyalty ratings in those markets exceed 90%, which means Alaska Airlines would be starting from zero if they tried to compete directly rather than partnering with us. They understand that acquiring Summit Airways gives them immediate access to established customer bases and operational infrastructure. As we approached Denver International Airport, I thought about the contrast between this arrival and my departure 5 days earlier. Then I'd been fleeing in emotional turmoil, uncertain about my future and convinced of my own limitations. Now I was returning as a business owner with resources and opportunities Derek had never imagined I possessed. The Alaska Airlines corporate lounge occupied premium space in the main terminal, offering panoramic views of aircraft operations and mountain ranges that reminded me why Dad had chosen aviation as his career. Marcus Chen was waiting when we arrived, having driven separately to ensure our legal representation matched the caliber of negotiating team Alaska Airlines had assembled. The Alaska Airlines delegation impressed me with both their preparation and their obvious respect for Summit Airways as a strategic asset. Rebecca Chen, their vice president for corporate development, led a team that included financial analysts, operational specialists, and legal advisors who'd clearly spent considerable time studying our company's performance and market position. Ms. Hayes, thank you for making time to meet with us, Rebecca said as we settled around a conference table overlooking active runways where Alaska Airlines planes taxied alongside aircraft from dozens of other carriers. We've been following Summit Airways' performance for several years, and we're excited about the possibilities for strategic collaboration. The formal presentation Alaska Airlines delivered exceeded my expectations for thoroughness and sophistication. They'd analyzed our route profitability, operational efficiency metrics, customer satisfaction ratings, and competitive positioning, with the kind of detail that reflected serious acquisition interest rather than casual partnership exploration. Summit Airways has achieved something remarkable in regional aviation, Rebecca continued, displaying charts showing our performance compared to other carriers. You've maintained profitability through multiple economic cycles while preserving customer service standards that larger airlines struggle to match. That combination of financial stability and operational excellence makes Summit Airways extremely valuable for strategic partnerships. The acquisition proposal they presented was structured as a cash and stock transaction valued at $54 million, representing a significant premium over the previous estimates Marcus had provided. Alaska Airlines was offering immediate liquidity that would provide financial security beyond anything Derek could influence, while also recognizing Summit Airways' strategic value in markets they wanted to penetrate. The transaction structure preserves Summit Airways' operational independence while providing access to Alaska Airlines' network, marketing resources, and purchasing power, Rebecca explained. Your management team would continue operating with autonomy over route decisions, customer service policies, and day-to-day business activities. I studied the proposal terms while Thomas, Helen, and Diana asked detailed questions about integration, logistics, employee retention policies, and long-term strategic planning. The financial security was appealing, but something about maintaining operational independence while benefiting from major airline resources seemed like an ideal compromise between security and autonomy. What kind of timeline are you envisioning for this transaction? I asked, noting that Alaska Airlines had clearly anticipated rapid decision-making rather than extended negotiation periods. We could complete due diligence and regulatory approvals within 90 days, Rebecca replied. The aviation industry moves quickly, and we believe Summit Airways represents the kind of strategic opportunity that justifies accelerated timelines. Marcus requested a brief recess to discuss the proposal privately with our team, and we moved to a smaller conference room where we could evaluate Alaska Airlines' offer without external pressure. The terms were generous, the strategic rationale was sound, and the integration approach preserved elements of Summit Airways' culture that had made Dad proud of his company. Victoria, this is an exceptional offer, Marcus said, reviewing the financial details. $54 million represents nearly 15% above current market valuations for comparable regional carriers. Alaska Airlines clearly views Summit Airways as a premium strategic asset. Helen agreed enthusiastically. The operational independence provisions address my primary concerns about acquisition transactions. Summit Airways would retain decision-making, authority over customer service policies, route planning, and employee relations, while gaining access to resources we could never develop independently. Thomas and Diana were equally positive about the strategic benefits Alaska Airlines partnership would provide: enhanced marketing reach, improved purchasing power for fuel and aircraft acquisitions, and access to their established maintenance facilities would strengthen Summit Airways' competitive position while preserving our regional market advantages. The question is whether you're ready to transition from business ownership to partnership management, Marcus said, studying my expression carefully. This transaction would provide immediate financial security, but it would also end your role as an independent airline owner. I thought about Dad's vision for Summit Airways as a family legacy and my own emerging interest in aviation industry leadership. The Alaska Airlines offer represented financial security that would last several lifetimes, but it also meant abandoning the independent business ownership I'd just rediscovered after years of believing myself financially dependent on Derek's career. I want to accept their partnership proposal, but with modifications to the transaction structure, I decided. Instead of a complete acquisition, I want to negotiate a strategic alliance that preserves Summit Airways' independence while providing access to Alaska Airlines' resources and network. Marcus smiled at my response, clearly pleased that I was thinking strategically about long-term opportunities rather than accepting the first attractive offer presented. Victoria, that's exactly the kind of business judgment your father would have been proud to see. You're thinking like an owner, rather than someone looking for a quick exit. We returned to the main conference room where Rebecca and her team were waiting with obvious anticipation about our response to their acquisition proposal. The Alaska Airlines executives had clearly invested considerable time and resources in developing their offer, and they were expecting either acceptance or substantive negotiations rather than alternative proposal structures. Rebecca, we appreciate the thoroughness of your acquisition proposal and the premium valuation Alaska Airlines has offered, I began, settling into the negotiating role with confidence that surprised me. However, I'm more interested in discussing strategic partnership arrangements that preserve Summit Airways' independence while providing mutual benefits for both companies. Rebecca's expression shifted to professional interest as she realized we were proposing alternative transaction structures rather than simply accepting or rejecting their acquisition terms. What kind of strategic partnership are you envisioning, Ms. Hayes? Code-sharing agreements on all overlapping routes, joint marketing initiatives in target demographics, shared frequent flyer programs, and coordinated fleet planning that optimizes both companies' operational efficiency, I replied, outlining partnership terms I'd been developing throughout their presentation. Alaska Airlines gains immediate access to Mountain West markets Summit Airways dominates, while we benefit from your established network in Pacific Northwest and Alaska corridors. The Alaska Airlines team exchanged glances that suggested they hadn't anticipated strategic partnership negotiations but were intrigued by the possibilities I was describing. Rebecca asked for detailed clarification about revenue-sharing arrangements, operational coordination requirements, and exclusivity provisions that would protect both companies' strategic interests. The negotiations continued for nearly 3 hours, with both teams developing partnership frameworks that provided mutual benefits without compromising either company's operational independence. Alaska Airlines would gain access to markets they'd struggled to penetrate profitably, while Summit Airways would benefit from enhanced purchasing power and network connectivity that strengthened our competitive position. This partnership structure preserves what makes Summit Airways successful while providing growth opportunities we couldn't achieve independently, Helen observed as we finalized preliminary agreement terms. Victoria, You've negotiated arrangements that maximize strategic benefits for both companies while maintaining our operational autonomy. Rebecca agreed to present our partnership proposal to Alaska Airlines Executive Committee with a recommendation for acceptance, noting that strategic alliances often provided more sustainable long-term value than outright acquisitions. We scheduled follow-up meetings for the following week to finalize legal documentation and implementation timelines. As the Alaska Airlines team departed, I felt a profound satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial returns or business achievement. I'd conducted myself as a competent business owner, making strategic decisions based on comprehensive analysis and professional consultation. Derek's dismissive comments about my business capabilities now seemed pathetic rather than intimidating. The drive back to Summit Airways headquarters provided time to reflect on how completely my life had changed since Derek's abandonment at this same airport 5 days earlier. His cruel lesson about dependence had accidentally triggered my emergence. As a confident business owner with resources and opportunities that exceeded anything he'd ever managed, Thomas, Helen, and Diana were unanimous in their enthusiasm about the Alaska Airlines partnership arrangements, recognizing that strategic alliances provided growth opportunities while preserving the company culture Dad had established. And I wanted to continue. The partnership would generate increased revenue, operational efficiencies, and market expansion possibilities that positioned Summit Airways for continued success. Victoria, I have to say that your negotiating approach impressed everyone in that room, Diana commented as we reviewed partnership terms. You demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking Summit Airways needs for future growth and competitive positioning. Back at Summit Airways headquarters, we spent the afternoon developing implementation plans for the Alaska Airlines partnership while also finalizing the expansion initiatives I'd approved earlier in the week. The aircraft acquisitions, new route, launches, and facility upgrades would proceed alongside partnership integration, creating a comprehensive growth strategy that leveraged multiple opportunities simultaneously. Marcus called around 4 o'clock with news that added another layer of satisfaction to an already successful day. Victoria, I've received inquiries from 2 aviation industry publications requesting interviews about your emergence as an active airline owner. Apparently, word about the Alaska Airlines partnership discussions has generated significant interest in Summit Airways' strategic direction. The media attention represented public recognition of my role as a business leader, rather than someone's wife who'd inherited assets she didn't understand. Derek had spent years ensuring my professional capabilities remained invisible to everyone, including myself. Now, aviation industry publications wanted to interview me about strategic decisions and business leadership. Schedule the interviews for next week, I decided. I want Summit Airways partnership arrangements finalized before discussing our strategic direction publicly, but I'm ready to represent the company professionally. As I prepared to leave Summit Airways headquarters that evening, I realized I needed to stop at Denver International Airport one more time. Not for business reasons, but to complete the psychological transformation that had begun with Derek's abandonment 5 days earlier. I wanted to stand in that same boarding area where he'd tried to teach me about limitation and dependence. This time as someone who owned an airline and had just negotiated partnership terms with one of the largest carriers in North America. The evening crowd at DIA moved with the familiar rhythm of business travelers and vacationing families, people navigating flight delays and gate changes with resigned patience. I walked to the exact spot where Derek had delivered his final condescending remarks before disappearing down the jet bridge, leaving me to figure out how to get home independently. Standing there now, I could barely remember the helpless confusion I'd felt watching his plane taxi toward takeoff. That woman had believed herself financially dependent on Derek's career success, grateful for whatever scraps of information he chose to share about their household finances. She'd measured her worth by his approval and defined her capabilities by his assessment of her limitations. The woman who stood in that boarding area Friday evening owned a $47 million airline company, had negotiated strategic partnerships with major carriers, and possessed financial independence Derek couldn't monitor or control. His lesson about dependence had become my education about empowerment and self-determination. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek, sent from what appeared to be a restaurant where he was having dinner with potential consulting clients. "Hope your airline meeting went well today. We should discuss your business involvement when I get home tonight. I have some concerns about the commitments you've been making." The patronizing tone that once would have made me anxious about his disapproval now seemed absurd rather than intimidating. Derek was expressing concerns about commitments I'd made using my own resources to grow my own company. He had no legal authority over my business decisions and no practical leverage to influence my strategic choices. I typed a response that was both polite and definitive. The meeting went very well. Alaska Airlines will be announcing our strategic partnership next week. I'll be happy to brief you on the general terms, but the detailed business arrangements are confidential corporate information. The drive home took me through suburban neighborhoods where I'd lived for 15 years, believing myself dependent on Derek's professional success for financial security. Now, those same streets looked different, like scenery from a play I'd finished performing. The comfortable house we'd shared, the carefully maintained lawn, the neighbors who knew me as Derek's supportive wife, all of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Derek's car was in the driveway when I arrived, meaning he'd returned from his client dinner earlier than expected. I found him in his home office reviewing financial documents spread across his desk, clearly attempting to assess our household assets and income sources now that he understood I controlled resources. He'd been hiding. "Victoria, we need to have a serious conversation about financial planning and asset protection," he said, without looking up from his calculator and bank statements. "If you're going to be making major business decisions independently, we need to restructure our personal finances to minimize risk exposure." I settled into the chair across from his desk, amused by his assumption that he would continue managing our personal financial arrangements despite having been systematically deceptive about my business ownership and inheritance rights. "Derek, I've already restructured our personal finances. I have independent banking relationships and separate business accounts that give me complete control over my resources." His expression shifted to alarm as he realized the implications of what I'd just said. "Victoria, you can't just make unilateral changes to our financial arrangements without discussion. We're married, which means we have shared obligations and mutual responsibilities." "Shared obligations and mutual responsibilities," I repeated thoughtfully. "Derek, you've spent 12 years ensuring I remained ignorant of my own financial resources while using those resources to subsidize your career. That doesn't sound like shared obligations or mutual responsibilities to me." Derek set down his calculator and faced me directly, his expression combining desperation with anger. "Victoria, I understand you're upset about how I handled the inheritance information, but you can't just destroy our marriage because of disagreements about financial management. We've built a life together over 15 years. We've built a life where you controlled every major decision while I remained ignorant of my own capabilities and resources," I corrected. "Derek, the life we built was based on systematic deception about my financial situation and deliberate suppression of my professional potential." He stood up and began pacing around his office with the agitated energy of someone whose fundamental assumptions about power and control were being challenged. "Victoria, even if you have technical ownership of this airline company, you're not equipped to manage complex business operations independently. You're going to need guidance and support, and I'm the logical person to provide that. Actually, Derek, I've been managing complex business operations quite successfully this week without your guidance or support," I replied calmly. "In fact, I've discovered that my business judgment is more accurate than yours. My strategic thinking is more sophisticated than yours, and my negotiating skills are more effective than yours." The insult hit him with visible force, striking at the core of his professional identity and self-worth. Derek had built his entire sense of superiority around being the successful partner in our marriage, the strategic thinker whose expertise guided major decisions and whose achievements provided our comfortable lifestyle. More effective than mine? Derek's voice rose with indignation. Victoria, I've built a consulting practice that generates substantial income and serves clients throughout the region. I have graduate training and 15 years of professional experience in strategic planning and business analysis. You've built a consulting practice that's been subsidized by income from my airline company, I responded. Derek, every business, development investment you've made, every competitive advantage you've enjoyed, every professional achievement you've celebrated has been funded by wealth you convinced me I didn't possess. Derek stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression that combined rage with dawning recognition of his complete loss of leverage. Victoria, if you think you can just cut me out of decision-making and financial planning, you're mistaken. I know more about our investments, our tax obligations, and our long-term financial planning than you do. Our investments, our tax obligations, our long-term financial planning, I repeated with genuine amusement. Derek, those are all based on income generated by my company using my inherited assets managed by trustees who report to me. You've been handling administrative details for resources that were never actually yours. The truth of what I was saying settled over him like a physical weight, and for the first time since his return from Miami, Derek looked genuinely defeated rather than merely frustrated. His entire sense of importance and authority had been built on managing financial resources that belonged to someone else. Victoria, what exactly are you planning to do? He asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Are you going to divorce me? Are you going to cut me off financially? Are you going to destroy everything we've built together? I'm not planning to destroy anything, Derek. I'm planning to build something authentic based on honest communication and mutual respect rather than deception and control. I stood up and moved toward the office door, feeling the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found the courage to speak truth to power. What does that mean practically? Derek called. After me, desperation evident in his voice. I paused in the doorway and turned back to face him. It means I'm going to continue running Summit Airways according to my own strategic judgment. It means I'm going to make financial decisions based on my own analysis and professional consultation. It means I'm going to build a future that reflects my own capabilities and interests rather than your assessment of my limitations. Derek stared at me with the expression of someone watching his world collapse in real time. And where does that leave me? That depends entirely on whether you're capable of building a relationship based on partnership and respect, rather than control and deception, I replied. Derek, you wanted to teach me about independence. Consider this lesson complete. I left him sitting in his home office, surrounded by financial documents that revealed the scope of his irrelevance to my actual economic situation. The man who'd abandoned me at Denver International Airport to teach me about dependence had accidentally triggered my emergence as an independent business owner, with resources and capabilities that exceeded his own. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the complete reversal Derek's cruelty had accomplished. His lesson about limitation had become my discovery of empowerment. His demonstration of control had become his loss of influence. His attempt to reinforce my dependence had become my declaration of independence. The woman he'd left stranded at the airport gate was gone forever, replaced by someone who owned an airline and understood exactly how to use that ownership effectively. Derek's shock when he learned about my business capabilities had been satisfying, but his recognition of his own irrelevance to my future success was even more rewarding. Monday morning would bring continued negotiations with Alaska Airlines, media interviews about Summit Airways' strategic direction, and operational decisions about aircraft acquisitions and route expansions. I would face those challenges as Victoria Hayes, airline owner and business leader, rather than Derek's dependent wife, grateful for whatever financial scraps he chose to share. Derek had intended his airport abandonment to teach me about my limitations, Instead, he'd accidentally reminded me that I was capable of far more than he'd ever allowed me to believe. His lesson about dependence had become my education about independence, empowerment, and the satisfaction of using my own capabilities to build my own future. The captain's announcement that would shock Derek was still coming, but it wouldn't be delivered over an aircraft intercom system. It would be written in quarterly reports showing Summit Airways' continued growth under my leadership, spoken in media interviews where I discussed strategic decisions as a respected industry executive, and demonstrated through business achievements that proved his assessment of my limitations had been completely wrong. Derek's cruel lesson was complete, but the education had been his rather than mine. He'd learned about consequences and accountability while I'd learned about capability and independence. The woman he'd abandoned at the airport gate had discovered. She owned an airline, and that discovery was changing everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.